Think about this for a second. Right now, when you buy a coffee and hand over a $20 bill, you don't even think about it. The cashier takes it, puts it in the register, and you move on with your life. You trust the money. Everyone trusts the money. It is the invisible glue holding the entire American economy together. But here is a reality that might genuinely shock you. If you were living in the United States in 1865, that trust absolutely did not exist. Because back then, when you handed someone a dollar, there was a staggering, almost unbelievable chance that the bill was completely fake. We aren't talking about a few bad counterfeit bills slipping into the system. According to historical records from the Treasury Department, by the end of the Civil War, up to 50% of all paper money circulating in the United States was counterfeit. Half the money in the entire country. Imagine trying to live your life, run a business, or feed your family when every second dollar in your pocket could turn out to be worthless trash at any given moment. The American economy wasn't just struggling. It was on the verge of a total, irreversible collapse. The very concept of money itself was bleeding out. And this terrifying financial crisis is exactly what gave birth to one of the most famous, yet deeply misunderstood institutions in American history, the United States Secret Service. Today, when you hear Secret Service, you immediately picture elite agents in dark suits, sunglasses, and earpieces guarding the president. You think of armored motorcades and snipers on the roof. We just assume it has always been this way. But here is the dark twist. The Secret Service was not created to protect the president. Not even close. It was created for one desperate reason: to hunt down the massive, highly organized underground network of counterfeiters who were destroying America from the inside. And the story of exactly how and when it was created involves a historical coincidence so dark it almost feels scripted. To understand how half the money in America became completely fake, you have to understand a bizarre reality about the country before the Civil War. During that time, the federal government did not print paper money at all. Instead, America was living through a period known as the free banking era, and it was absolute financial chaos. If you wanted to start a bank back then, you didn't need a massive federal charter. Pretty much anyone who could scrape together a little bit of capital and meet some basic local rules could open up a bank. And here's the craziest part. Every single one of these local institutions was legally allowed to print its own paper money. We aren't just talking about a few big banks in New York or Philadelphia. We are talking about small-town banks, railroad companies, local general stores, and even churches printing their own custom-designed cash. By the 1850s, there were more than 8,000 different types of paper money circulating across the United States. Imagine the absolute nightmare this created for an ordinary working person. If you were a merchant in Pennsylvania, a traveler might walk into your shop and try to pay you with a banknote from a tiny, obscure bank in rural Indiana. You have never been to Indiana. You have no idea what their money is actually supposed to look like. You don't even know if that specific bank really exists, or if it already went bankrupt last week. And this is exactly where the counterfeiters found their golden opportunity. If the entire country is flooded with 8,000 completely different, unregulated designs of money, how could anyone possibly tell what was real and what was fake? You didn't even need to be a master criminal to pass a bad bill. You just had to invent a fake bank, print some official-looking paper with a bald eagle or a train on it, and hand it to a confused shopkeeper 3 states away. It was the ultimate playground for scammers. But to fight back, ordinary Americans had to rely on a tool that seems almost comical today. So how did an average shopkeeper survive in a world with 8,000 different types of money? They used a tool called a banknote reporter. Think of this as a massive, constantly updated survival guide for American capitalism. It was a thick, pocket-sized booklet that merchants kept right next to their cash registers. Every time a customer handed over a piece of paper money, the entire transaction came to a dead stop. The shopkeeper would pull out this booklet and frantically flip through the pages. They had to look up the specific bank, see if it was still in business, and check the current exchange rate. Because a $5 bill from a bank in Ohio might only be worth $3 when you tried to spend it in New York. But more importantly, they were scanning for counterfeit warnings. These booklets contained thousands of highly detailed descriptions of known fakes. They would have warnings like, "Look for the missing tail feather on the eagle," or "Check if Washington's nose looks slightly crooked." It was exhausting, and honestly, it barely worked. Counterfeiting became so incredibly widespread that it wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was practically an American pastime. Some fraudsters didn't even bother copying real money. They just created wildcat banks, fake institutions, supposedly located deep in the wilderness where only wildcats lived. They would print beautiful, official-looking notes for these imaginary banks and spend them across the country. The criminals eventually got so bold and so wealthy that they started counterfeiting the banknote reporters themselves. They printed fake guidebooks that literally told merchants their fake money was actually real. It was an absolute financial circus. America was trapped in a frantic cat-and-mouse game that it was actively losing. But as bad as the free banking era was, the real crisis hadn't even started yet. Because in 1861, the first shots of the American Civil War were fired. And suddenly, the United States government needed to figure out how to pay for the bloodiest conflict in its entire history, which led to a radical financial decision that changed everything. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Union government faced a massive, terrifying problem. Wars are unimaginably expensive. President Abraham Lincoln had to figure out how to pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers, buy mountains of weapons, and keep the country from going bankrupt. And those 8,000 random, chaotic local banknotes were simply not going to get the job done. The federal government desperately needed a real, unified currency. So, for the first time in American history, Congress authorized the printing of a national paper currency. They passed the Legal Tender Act of 1862, and the Treasury began pumping millions of dollars directly into the economy. These new bills featured complex engravings and were printed with a special, patented green ink on the reverse side. People immediately started calling them greenbacks. This was supposed to be the perfect solution. The government genuinely believed that by creating one standard, official currency, they would finally kill off the counterfeiters. After all, everyone would soon recognize what a real greenback looked like, making it impossible to pass off a fake. The green ink was even specifically chosen because early cameras couldn't photograph it properly. It sounded like a brilliant, foolproof plan. But it backfired in the worst possible way. What the federal government didn't realize was that they hadn't stopped the counterfeiters at all. Instead, they had just handed them the ultimate jackpot. Before the greenback, a criminal had to figure out which of the 8,000 local currencies was worth faking and where they could safely spend it. Now, the government had conveniently given them one single, universally accepted target. If a counterfeiter could figure out how to perfectly copy this one specific green piece of paper, they wouldn't just be fooling a local shopkeeper. They could spend that fake money absolutely anywhere in the United States. The stakes had never been higher. And almost overnight, disorganized street-level scammers transformed into massive, highly organized criminal syndicates that were about to plunge the country into absolute darkness. The moment the greenback was released, the counterfeiters went to work. And they didn't just copy the money, they perfected it. You see, back then, counterfeiting wasn't just a petty street crime. It was high art. The men creating these fake bills weren't random thugs hiding in dark alleys. They were master engravers. Many of them had actually been trained by the government or by legitimate banks. But they quickly realized something. Working for the law paid a boring, standard salary. Working against the law could make them millionaires overnight. These rogue artists began forming massive, highly structured criminal empires. They built their own hidden printing presses. They sourced high-quality paper that felt exactly like the real thing. And what about that special, patented green ink the government thought was impossible to copy? The counterfeiters simply hired top-tier chemists to reverse engineer it. Once the fake money was printed, the syndicates used a brilliant distribution network. The masterminds never spent the fake money themselves. Instead, they sold the counterfeit cash in bulk at a heavy discount to middlemen. Those middlemen then hired hundreds of street-level runners, known in the underworld as shovers. A shover's only job was to take the fake bills, travel to busy towns, buy cheap everyday items, and collect real government money as their change. It was a flawless, invisible system. And it worked terrifyingly well. By 1865, the situation had escalated from a criminal annoyance to an absolute national security crisis. The fake money was pouring into the economy faster than the government could even track it. That terrifying statistic I mentioned at the very beginning became a harsh reality. Up to 50% of all the money changing hands in America was totally fake. The United States government panicked. If the public completely lost faith in the greenback, the entire financial system would freeze. Citizens would stop accepting paper money. The country would collapse entirely. Something drastic had to be done. The government needed a new kind of weapon. a force that didn't even exist yet. Imagine an underground network so powerful it operated like a 19th century version of the dark web. This wasn't just a few random guys hiding in a dirty basement. It was a massive, highly organized corporate empire of crime. At the very top of this illegal empire were the master engravers, men like Pete McCartney and Ben Boyd. These guys were absolute legends in the criminal underworld. They were so incredibly skilled at carving the tiny, complex details of a dollar bill into metal plates that their fake money was often considered better quality than the real money printed by the US government. They became underground millionaires. But how did they manage to operate so openly without getting caught? The answer is simple: total, widespread corruption. The counterfeit syndicates were making so much money that they could easily afford to buy off everyone in their path. They paid off local police officers. They bribed judges. They even had powerful politicians on their secret payrolls. If a street-level shover ever got arrested for passing a fake bill, the syndicate's corrupt lawyers would step in, pay off the local sheriff, and the criminal would be back on the streets the very next day. The federal government quickly realized a terrifying truth. They could not rely on local law enforcement to fix this massive problem. Local cops were either too scared of the syndicates or they were actively working for them. If America was going to survive, the Treasury Department needed its own dedicated elite squad. A federal agency that could cross state lines, bypass corrupt local cops, and hunt these masterminds down one by one. And so, a bold plan was pitched to the highest level of the American government. It landed directly on the desk of President Abraham Lincoln. What happened next is one of the most chilling and dramatic ironies in American history. Because the very day Lincoln decided to create this elite agency would also turn out to be the very last day of his life. It is the morning of April 14, 1865. The Civil War is finally coming to an end. The nation is exhausted, battered, but hopeful. However, inside the White House, the mood is completely different. Secretary of the Treasury, Hugh McCulloch, is in an absolute panic. He sits down with President Abraham Lincoln and lays out the terrifying reality. McCulloch tells the president that the counterfeiters are winning. The fake money is spreading too fast. If they do not act immediately, the American dollar will become completely worthless. McCulloch proposes a radical idea, a brand new federal agency under the Treasury Department. A team of elite undercover operatives whose sole mission is to hunt down the counterfeit syndicates. A secret service. Lincoln listens carefully. He understands that the very survival of the country's economy is at stake. He agrees to the plan. He verbally authorizes the creation of the United States Secret Service, right there in the Oval Office. It is a massive, historic decision to save American capitalism. But this is where history takes a dark, tragic turn. That evening, feeling a rare moment of relief, Lincoln decides to take his wife to a play at Ford's Theater. He goes without any federal bodyguards. He goes without any heavy security detail. The local police officer assigned to guard his door actually leaves his post to get a drink. Because the agency Lincoln had just authorized hours earlier had absolutely nothing to do with protecting his life. As Lincoln sits in his private box, John Wilkes Booth steps out of the shadows and pulls the trigger. The president is assassinated. The dark irony is almost impossible to believe. The man who created the Secret Service was murdered on the exact same day he created it. The agency was born in the direct shadow of a massive national tragedy. And yet, their mission did not change. They weren't formed to avenge the fallen president. They were formed to save the American dollar. And to do that, they needed a leader who was absolutely ruthless. When you are fighting a massive, deeply corrupted criminal empire, you cannot send in a regular police officer. You need someone who knows the shadows. You need a monster to fight the monsters. Enter William P. Wood. He was chosen to be the very first chief of the United States Secret Service, and he was the exact opposite of a polished, rule-following lawman. Wood was a veteran of the Mexican-American War, a former prison superintendent, and a man who understood the criminal mind better than anyone else in Washington. He was absolutely ruthless, and he knew that to destroy the counterfeiters, he had to play their dark game. The first thing Wood did was break all the traditional rules of law enforcement. Because local police forces were heavily bribed and completely useless, Wood built his new agency in total secrecy. His men didn't wear shiny badges. They didn't wear sharp blue uniforms. They operated entirely undercover. They were, quite literally, a secret service. But Wood's tactics were what truly made him a terrifying force. He didn't just arrest the low-level street scammers. He went directly after the untouchable masterminds. And to get to them, Wood frequently used methods that were highly questionable, deeply controversial, and borderline illegal. He actively recruited former criminals, paying them cash under the table to act as his secret informants. He used brutal psychological warfare and intense intimidation to force low-level crooks to betray their bosses. If a corrupt local judge tried to protect a counterfeiting ring, Wood's men would completely ignore the local laws, kick down the doors, and drag the criminals straight into federal custody. Wood was a rogue operative acting with the full, unchecked blessing of the United States Treasury. He unleashed his undercover agents across the country, striking pure panic into the underground syndicates. For the first time in American history, the counterfeit kings were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. And what happened next was a brutal, invisible war that would finally decide the fate of the American economy. The Invisible War had officially begun. William P. Wood and his secret operatives swept across the country like a shadow. They did not care about local police jurisdictions. They did not care about corrupt local politicians trying to protect their criminal friends. They had one single mission, and they executed it with terrifying, ruthless efficiency. In their very first year of operation, the Secret Service shut down over 200 massive counterfeiting operations. They didn't just arrest the low-level street runners. They kicked down the doors of the hidden printing factories in the dead of night. They smashed the illegal presses into pieces. They seized millions of dollars in fake paper money before it could hit the streets, and most importantly, they confiscated the heavy metal engraving plates. By taking the master engravers out of the game, the Secret Service cut the head off the snake. Without the artists, the syndicates lost their ability to create high-quality fakes. The criminal bosses panicked. Their leaders were suddenly being dragged into federal prison, and their massive, untouchable empires began to rapidly collapse. The dark web of the 19th century was being systematically dismantled. The results were absolutely staggering. Within just a few short years, the amount of fake money circulating in the United States plummeted from that terrifying 50% down to a fraction of a percent. The nightmare of flipping a coin every time you accepted a dollar bill slowly faded away. Ordinary citizens and merchants could finally trust the greenback. The American economy, which had been standing on the absolute edge of a cliff, was pulled back to safety. The Secret Service had done the impossible. They had saved the United States financial system from total ruin. But their massive success created a brand new, unexpected situation. The federal government now possessed the most elite, highly trained undercover intelligence agency in the entire country. And as the 19th century came to a close, a new wave of extreme political violence was about to strike America. The government was about to realize that protecting the nation's money was no longer enough. They needed to protect its leaders. For decades after saving the American dollar, the Secret Service kept doing exactly what they were originally created to do. They stayed in the shadows and hunted financial criminals. But while they were busy protecting America's wallet, America's leaders were left completely exposed. In 1901, President William McKinley was attending a public exposition in Buffalo, New York. Just like Abraham Lincoln, his security was disorganized and incredibly weak. An assassin managed to walk right up to him in a crowded room, pulled out a hidden gun, and shot him twice in the chest. McKinley's death absolutely shook the nation. He was the third American president to be assassinated in less than 40 years. The federal government suddenly woke up to a terrifying reality. They already possessed the most elite, highly trained, undercover intelligence force in the entire world. But they were using them to chase fake pieces of paper while the commander-in-chief was left totally vulnerable. Congress demanded an immediate, radical change. In 1902, the Secret Service was officially given a brand new full-time mission, presidential protection. Those undercover financial cops stepped out of the shadows, put on the dark suits, and became the elite human shield we recognize today. It is a crazy, almost poetic twist of history. The men and women who are willing to take a bullet for the president today belong to an agency that was only created because half the country's money was completely fake. They did not start by guarding the leader of the free world. They started by guarding a simple piece of green paper. If this hidden history shifted your perspective on how America actually works, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. We go deep into the hidden machinery of power, money, and the secret stories that shape our world in ways most people never think about. And if you want to keep pulling on this thread, there is another video coming soon that you will not want to miss.